Hi, I'm Lauren Rivers, author of Blue Moon, and today I'd like to discuss my criteria for evaluating the overall quality of a story. We all go into any kind of narrative with certain expectations, and while this doesn't necessarily make it a good or bad story, these are the things I look for when considering how well the storyteller has done their job. In considering the qualifications, I broke it down to 3 simple rules. Now obviously this doesn't cover everything, and there is plenty of room for both interpretation and individual taste, but these are the things that, at least for me personally, are strong sticking points when they are not followed during the course of a story. To start, I'm going to list the rules in order, and then go into more detail one at a time. Number 1. The story must make objective sense. Number 2. Rules and mythology must be consistent with what the storyteller establishes. And number 3. Character behavior must be consistent with the background and personal history provided. So now let's go over each one, and I'll provide examples to show you what I mean. The first rule is the most important. When I say that your story has to make objective sense, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the person walking into the bookstore to find something new, or someone skimming their new releases on their streaming service searching for a new show to binge. Whatever kind of media you're looking for, this is what I call the great equalizer, because especially in the world of Twitter, where there are constant demands for your attention, you only have a limited window to capture your audience, and you have to consider that whether you write stories or just want a new DVD to watch. Even if you're not aware of it, you're constantly examining movie trailers and book jackets to find something to elevate one over the rest. Now let's pretend for a moment that you are that customer. You and a friend are trying to pick a movie to watch. You see the poster and remember that you've seen the trailer before. You have 60 seconds to explain to your friend the basic premise of what you saw. Go on. I'll give you a moment. Not so easy, is it? Advertisers and self-published authors, like this zebra, are faced with this challenge all the time. It's an important skill to be able to quickly and concisely explain your story in as few words as possible, including all of the important details while not giving anything major away. For you writers, it's important to step outside your work for a moment and look at your work like one of your readers. Of course your story will make sense to you, but can you explain it to someone else? Now let's go over an example. A young adventurer saves the princess from the evil empire. Simple, I know, but in that one sentence it tells you everything you need to know. You know who the protagonist is, the young adventurer. You know who the antagonist is, the evil empire. And you know what he's trying to do, save the princess. Now obviously your story will be more complicated than that, but hopefully you get the point. Additionally, and this is a good one for gauging the skill level of the storyteller in question, how well does the author fill you in on what you need to know? As a creator, you cannot assume that your audience has seen any of your previous work. Of course, we'd like to think they'll check out anything from the same creative team, but it's not a given and shouldn't be treated as such. Does the author lay the groundwork necessary for you to understand the story world, who the characters are, and what's going on? If the answer to any of these questions is no, then you may be dealing with an unskilled writer. Now I'd like to stress that this comes from experience, but it's a fine balance between telling your audience what they need to know and drowning them in the details. Avoid exposition dumps, and bear in mind your audience that has seen the last book or movie. You want to refresh their memory, but not bore them with references or material they might already know. Lastly, it's important to note how well it follows narrative structure. Now this won't be as important to non-writers, but the job of the first few chapters is to answer 3 questions for the discerning audience. Why now, why here, and why these people? The story should answer this naturally, but to explain, most stories have an event that kickstarts the narrative. Look at any movie and watch the beginning. Typically, in the opening scene, something happens that sets everything into motion. It's usually a major event, something that will forever change the world your story is in. This event usually answers the other 2 questions along with it, but the important thing is that by the time they finish the first act, this should be clear and self-evident. The second rule states that rules and mythology must be consistent with what their creator establishes. Story worlds, just like the world we live in now, operates on certain basic principles. There are many things we do not need to verify personally to know that they are true. Just like I do not need to drop a hammer to know that it has fallen, so too should the narrative in question have its own rules that everyone must follow, whether internal laws or external observations. Unskilled writers tend to bend the rules to fit their needs rather than find a way to play the restrictions to their advantage. For example, an unskilled writer may have their hero gain a sudden burst of power at a key moment without any training or event to justify this development. Now, a skilled writer can make this work if done well, but the reason we establish rules for our story worlds is to keep things consistent so that we do not break the suspension of disbelief. When following a narrative, imagine it like meeting a new person. You get to talking and they start telling you about their life. You have no reason to distrust this person, so you assume everything they tell you is true. A narrative is the same way. We assume the author is credible until a contradiction appears that suggests this isn't the case. For an example, let's meet the people of Donutland. Now everybody in Donutland gets fresh donuts on Monday. Everybody except Mary. Mary goes and gets her donuts on Tuesday. The first thing the audience is going to ask is why. What makes Mary different? Now, while we do not need to know this right away, it does need to be explained eventually, or we continue to ask this question, distracting us from the story at hand. Bear in mind that exceptions do not need to be explained immediately. Perhaps your story is about John, who likes Mary. He's trying to find an excuse to meet her, so he follows her to learn her routine. Now it's a mystery. John later discovers Mary lives out of town and takes care of her sick mother, so she cannot get to the donut shop until Tuesday. Now he, and we, understand. Exception resolved. Let's say magic in your world requires a key item to operate. Everyone must have a talisman to cast spells. Suddenly, everything is thrown into chaos when someone appears who doesn't need one. While this is fine as long as it is part of the mystery being investigated, it eventually requires an explanation for the story to make sense. Remember, rules exist to protect the author. It's important to be consistent with how you apply the conditions under which your world operates because you are establishing a certain level of trust with your audience. If the author fails to follow their own rules, either by openly deviating from them or failing to explain exceptions, everything the author has told you becomes suspect. With the second rule, the last thing to keep in mind is remember the side effects of the decisions you make while world building. Choices you make while assembling your story have ripple effects on the world around them. Things you tell your audience are not isolated statements and can include, inadvertently or otherwise, caveats that come with them. In the world of Magicopolis, magic belongs only to the elites. The obvious question is, what do they use it for? Let's say, for the sake of this example, they use it in order to maintain control over an oppressive empire. This suggests a resistance. You will not find shops selling magic items to the masses. By making this decision, you must remember that making that choice suggests others. In another example, airships are the most common form of transportation. They are powered by a semi-rare substance. This means travel will likely be limited to the military and the wealthy. Obtaining the resource may be a central factor in the conflict that drives your narrative forward. The last rule states that a character's behavior must be consistent with the background and personal history provided. What I mean by that is, like I stated earlier, we take what the author tells us and build our mental picture of this character based on the information provided, assuming this to be on good faith. In other words, we only know what we are told about this character either by direct action, dialogue, or exposition given during the course of the story. As a rule, people generally follow Newton's laws of motion, which states that an object at rest will remain at rest, or an object in motion remains in motion unless acted upon by another force. To put it in terms of behavior, you generally live your life how you want unless something happens to change it. Alternatively, you will not pick up a new hobby or skill unless provided an inspiration to do so. Similarly, according to Newton's third law about applying force, when people try to coerce you into doing things you don't want to do, most of the time you'll push back in response just like your characters will. Inexperienced writers sometimes provide characters with abilities not justified by the story thus far. An old example I once remembered is the trope that when people discover alien technology, instantly they're experts. This, of course, presents a cognitive dissonance when we are now faced with conflicting pieces of information. We know they cannot understand how to manipulate the alien technology, yet at the same time, they obviously do. Let's flip it around the other way. Let's say that your character is an ex-soldier. This explains how he will have combat experience and weapons training, as well as other related skills. The rank you assign him or her may tell you to what degree they have mastered these abilities. Now, I'm not looking to nitpick here. All I want you to do is consider putting something in your character's background to explain what you want them to do. The last example is something I see a lot with people who use younger characters as their protagonists. If your character is under 20, they're a lot more likely to make mistakes and react emotionally. Now, this is not to say that this is universally true, but it is unlikely that people that young will be experts at their fields, particularly in the case of accumulated life experience. Now, I'm not saying that you can't have a boy genius, but bear in mind that the audience may be more skeptical of your 17-year-old quantum physicist or martial arts expert, especially if the talent you have provided them is nationally famous. Lastly, bear in mind that even if the audience is not aware of a character's history, their behavior must be consistent with what the author knows of their backstory. To explain, let's say your main character is closed off. This may be due to trauma, addictions, or a dark secret in their past. While we as the audience do not know the specifics, if we're even aware of it at all, it interrupts the story if we see behavior that contradicts this information once we are informed of its existence. For example, if your character has a history with drinking, they may avoid alcohol or discussion of it altogether, and decline invitations to places that serve drinks. This only heightens the impact when they give in to this addiction later. Feel free to place hints, but don't show the character drinking responsibly, and then later throw in their history of addiction. What that does is break the image we've had of the character up to this point, making it very hard to take them seriously from this point forward. That's all for my 3 rules, and hopefully this has given you something to think about the next time someone says, "What did you think of the story?"
Thanks for watching, and if you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. You can also find me on Twitter and a few other places on the web, or support me via Patreon or Ko-fi. Zebra hugs!